Chapter 17. Telltale Tracks. As the drawbridge rose creakingly, Nancy put her car engine into reverse, sped backward down the incline and into the courtyard. She was just in time to keep the convertible from turning over or being crushed. "Nancy, don't give me a scare like that again," Bess begged. Her cousin looked at her disdainfully. "You'd think it was Nancy's fault. We're lucky to be alive thanks to her." Bess apologized, saying she had not meant to imply Nancy was a poor driver. To forestall an argument, Nancy said, "What on earth made the bridge rise?" The three girls climbed out of the car. They looked at the bridge, which was not tightly in place in the castle wall. "The bridge certainly wouldn't go up by itself," said George, "unless the vibration of the policeman's car loosened the wires and released the secret mechanism." "This means we're prisoners here, unless we leave the car and swim across," Bess said with a sigh. "Not necessarily," Nancy told her. "Maybe I can let the drawbridge down." "How about the police?" Bess asked suddenly. "Maybe if we honk the horn loudly enough, they'll come back." She moved toward the car to do this. But though Bess kept her hand on the horn for half a minute, there was no response. George and Nancy had moved to the drawbridge. Together, they tugged and yanked at the heavy iron chains which let the bridge up and down. One side worked, but the other refused to budge. "I think the trouble's up above where the chain goes through the wall," Nancy stated. "I'll go and find out." "But how?" George asked. "You can't climb up a sheer wall." Nancy smiled. "But look at the step-like niches in the stonework," she said. "They might be just the trick." "Okay," said George. "But what are you going to hold on to?" "There are some pretty heavy vines on this wall," Nancy observed. The next moment she had grasped a stout stem of the ivy. She swung herself onto it to try its strength. "It'll hold me all right," she said. Quickly, Nancy inched her way up the wall, using the vines and niches. When she reached the top of the drawbridge, she began to examine the bulky chain and the cogwheel over which it ran. Nancy discovered that the chain was wound around two teeth in such a way that the wheel could not turn and release the bridge. Holding on to the vine stem firmly with one hand, the young sleuth endeavored to lift the chain and unwind it. At first she could not budge the heavy iron links, and once she almost lost her balance. "Be careful," George warned. "Want me to come up and help?" "Maybe you'd better," said Nancy. "But whatever you do, pick out a different vine from mine." George chuckled and followed instructions. "I knew being a tomboy would come in handy someday," she called, as she made her ascent. Soon she was beside her chum. The two girls worked hard, but they did not dare tug too strenuously for fear that the force would unbalance them in their precarious positions. Finally, they managed to get the links back into the cogs in a straight line. "Thank goodness," said George. Nancy heaved a sigh. "I'm pretty relieved myself. Now all we have to do is see if it works." George grinned. "And I suppose you'd like me to climb down and test it." She descended and released the two chains. At once the drawbridge was lowered. "That's simply marvelous!" cried Bess. "You girls are positive geniuses." "Anyway," said George, "we're not such bad mechanics." When Nancy reached the ground, she insisted that the cousins walk across the bridge. "I'll come alone in the car. If anything goes wrong again, you can hurry off for help." Bess and George waited with bated breath, but Nancy made it safely. Her friends climbed into the convertible, and she headed toward town. "I'm starved," said Bess. "Adventure always makes me hungry." George laughed. "Tension is supposed to take away your appetite," she said. not increase it. Nancy suggested that they head for the brass kettle. Maybe Mrs. Hemstead will give us some more information about Mr. Seaman. When they entered the tea room, the girls were delighted to see the old lady rocking in her chair. At once, she motioned to them. "I haven't had a soul to talk to all morning," she complained. "Tell me what you've been doing." "We've been out for a ride," Nancy said nonchalantly. "You know, Mrs. Hemstead, I never have received the present from Mr. Seaman that he told you about. Has he been around lately?" "No, he hasn't," Mrs. Hemstead replied. "But you know, I heard a funny thing about him." Instantly the girls were alert and asked her what it was. The old lady rocked determinedly, as if she were angry. "He fooled me, that's what he did," she said. "All this time I thought he was a traveling salesman, but I was told just last night that he's working out at old Mrs. Wilson's." The girls could hardly suppress smiles. Mrs. Hemstead felt that she had been duped and did not like it. She went on to say that Mrs. Wilson was a wealthy widow who lived on the outskirts of Deep River. "Up to a short time ago," Mrs. Hemstead continued, "Mrs. Wilson kept 4 servants, but now she has only a couple. I suppose the woman is Mr. Seaman's wife. Mrs. Wilson never comes to town anymore. There are rumors around here she's not well." "That's too bad," Nancy said sympathetically. "Do Mr. and Mrs. Seaman take care of her?" "I suppose so," Mrs. Hemstead said. "Folks don't know what's going on out there anymore. The couple never come to town either. They order all their food and supplies by telephone. Funny thing, too, the delivery boys never see anybody. The money is left outside in the milk box." Instantly, Nancy's mind flew back to the similar story about Grandmother Horton. Could the Seamans be the same couple she had had? Nancy told herself she was going to follow up this clue at once. As casually as possible, she asked Mrs. Hemstead the location of Mrs. Wilson's home. "Well, when you get out on the main road, you take the road toward the old castle. After you pass the castle, take the next road to the left that you come to. Mrs. Wilson's house is way down at the end near the water." The 3 girls explained that they wanted to have lunch and said goodbye to Mrs. Hemstead. As soon as they were seated and had ordered their luncheon, Nancy told Bess and George that she wanted to go out to the Wilson home directly after the girls finished eating. About an hour later, Nancy drove within sight of the Wilson house. She decided to hide her car along the wooded roadside. "Let's walk up the Wilson driveway and try not to make ourselves conspicuous," she cautioned. Fortunately, the drive was a curving one, bordered by trees and thick shrubbery. Suddenly, George exclaimed, "Look, tire tracks that don't match. They're just like the ones we saw at the castle." The girls stooped to examine them. 3 of the tires had parallel grooves. The one on the right rear wheel was diamond-shaped. "We're on the trail of something, all right," Bess remarked. "But let's not get ourselves captured." They hurried along the side of the road, ready to hide among the trees and bushes if a car should come along or any people appear. "Girls," Nancy whispered tensely. She pointed to their left. The tower of Moonstone Castle was in plain view. Anyone standing here could have watched Jake Suggs signaling. "Oh," said Bess, "I've seen enough. Let's go back." "No," said Nancy. "We have a real clue this time." She came from behind a tree, walked up to the front door, and boldly lifted the big brass knocker. End of chapter 17.